Since February 24 that Russia invaded Ukraine, the world has not been the same. The global cost is estimated at north of $400 billion. As the conflict lingers, the global headache continues. The corresponding sanctions from Western nations on Russia and its exports has further harmed the global economy and not only the recipients of those sanctions. Crude oil prices have moved worth of $100 and its distillates like petrol, diesel and aviation fuel have doubled and in some nations even tripled in price. The corresponding supply chain disruptions have increased inflation rate of many nations in Africa where imports of food and agricultural products were normally bought from either Ukraine or Russia. Other commodities like gold and other precious metals have also experienced a rapid increase in prices. To reduce the cost and ensure more production at home and possibly abroad, the United States government is releasing part of its Strategic Petroleum Reserves, or SPR, and this is intended to start in May. But what impact will it have on global demand and supply dynamics of the black gold? On the show today, our focus is on the possible impacts of the release of U.S. oil reserves on Africa. And this is Business Edge. I am Lekan Onabanjo, standing in for Tolu Lokpe Adileri Balogun. And joining me on the program from Abuja is Desmond, Agboifo, an energy expert and director, Desyton Energy. Good morning to you, Desmond. Thanks for joining us on Business Edge.
Good morning, and so pleased to be with you this morning. Hope you're all doing well and safe.
Of course, we are good. Let's start this way. The U.S. government is selling a record amount of oil from its national reserves to tame soaring U.S. fuel prices as quickly as possible. But it's been speculated that the plan could backfire if the stockpile are not quickly replenished. Now, do you think this would have any sort of repercussion?
Absolutely. I think the first premise of this discourse should be focused mainly on what the key issue would look like, because overall, I mean, we've seen the rising tensions within Russia and Ukraine, and of course that has also created a bit of a demand buffer in the global energy scene, and we've also seen that has also created some level of price hikes over the last 12 years. I mean, currently we have a 3-digit oil price. And I think that's also a bit unprecedented because we know that the oil prices have been fairly low in the last couple of 3 to 4 years ago. So yes, with the issue we see on ground, we see, I mean, some key dynamics coming up in the scene, and also will expect that to be a bit longer than unnecessary, to be honest, because we see a lot of countries even trying to push back and in the midst of all the discussions around global warming and all of those accelerated energy transition programs. So yes, it's a bit unprecedented in this time.
Well, we see a bit of caution on the side of the U.S. shale producers who are said not to be willing to boost output. Now, why is that? And of course, why is Biden opting to release reserves instead of having to increase output production?
Great. Again, if we look at the dynamics of the energy industry, it's always good to go back to the fundamentals, And we know that the U.S. is perhaps one of the biggest consumer of oil, and of course, pushing around the 120 million barrels as opined by the IEA, countries from 1st of April, it's a bit expected because, of course, we know very well that when the prices are up. Of course, the demand is, of course, the demand goes where the prices will be. So, to your question, I think it's a yes. The prices will be a bit higher, just over the long term, and the impact on the US will be a bit more harsher, if you allow, because we can see that generally the US does around maybe 12 million barrels or so. And we can see that that's also going to be a bit of a bite. I mean, considering all the other OECD countries also trying to, key into that mix also. So in total, we're looking at 180 million barrels, being pushed over the next 6 months.
Well, we understand that U.S. is releasing 180 million barrels, just as you said. That's about 5% of the total reserve, and other members of the International Energy Agency are also said to be releasing an additional 60 million barrels. Will this have any sort of immediate long-term effect on global prices?
Obviously, that's expected. The dynamics of the industry will experience that bit of a shock. Just to put it in context, the world consumes about 97, 98 million barrels a day. And if we're looking at just around 180 million over an average of about 6 months, that's about 30 million barrels just on an average per month. And then if we fix that within the context of daily consumption versus demand, of course that also bites hard. So should that go that direction, we will really see a bit of a constraint, particularly within the African space where we do about 4 million barrels a day production, all in all as a demand. So of course when that hits us hard, we'll start seeing the impact in the African space, obviously.
Yes, talking about Africa now, you talked about the fact that it's may hit us hard, but then do you think that Africans can actually put up a guard against these shocks or against these long-term effects? Because, of course, the additional outputs is something that is inevitable, but then can Africans or African countries put up a guard just to mitigate the after effects?
Yes, I think the best approach will be a no one size fits all, to be very honest, because looking at, for example, Nigeria within the African space, who is about the biggest producer, and the likes of Angola too. The model to be able to cushion those those shocks will be a bit more focused on the country specifically. But what that really means is that for a case in point within the African space, the biggest producers will be able to manage the excesses over the short term, but not in the long term. Because again, as you may be aware, the African countries depend a lot more on consumptions of fossil fuels as a primary source of energy just over the last 30, 40 years as we've seen. So shocks in the market will always have an impact within the African space. And the next step to your question will be, how do we manage the excesses? And I think one of them will be to be able to create a bit of a balance in our demand, consume what we produce and produce what we consume. And then of course, on the other side of trying to get that in context, we also need to make sure that we have the right infrastructures in place to be able to make sure that we sustain and perhaps even stabilize our productions nationally, And then the third part of my suggestion will be to create what they call production capacity planning that will also help countries to be able to manage their productions, and keep it up in the levels to which they can be able to sustain that. What that will mean economically will be that they will be able to drive in the right capexes to drive projects and also create an environment to be able to manage the operating strategies comfortably.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the fact that they need to up or rev up the capacity in terms of production. But then, of course, you understand that the hike in global price is an opportunity for Africa oil producers to actually receive a windfall. Do you think that they are already looking towards this area? Do you think they are willing to take up this particular area in order to capitalize on the Russian invasion and all whatnot that it has brought about? And if they are not, how do you think they can quickly get set to it?
Great. To be honest, I don't think we are doing enough. We are doing our bits. Of course, taking it from the biggest part of the world, a part of the production countries, which is Nigeria, and other African key players. What we can do to be able to get that in a better perspective is to be able to look at what we demand for and produce based on what we need. And of course, there should be that balance to ensure that we can be able to manage the excesses. Because again, if you look at the stocks, for example, in the US allied members of the IE, which make up about 31% of the industrialized countries, of course, but that doesn't include Russia in this context. We can see that, of course, we have seen a release of just about a month's production, and of course, in fifth in agency history. So, what that really means is that, taking in context that just about 240 million barrels will be available in the global market in the next 6 months, that would spell some serious concerns for Africa because when of course, as we know from basic economics, when the prices, when the demand, drops, which means the supply goes overboard, then of course we'll see a shock in the prices. And because again, most African countries are oil dependent, projects are often tied towards what the benchmark prices would be. That was to be a bit of a shock in the economy. So to be able to manage that is for us to ensure that we create a much more strategic efforts and imperative from the national reserve of each countries. I may not be able to speak to the question on countries specifically, but on a broader scale, we would expect countries to be able to adopt strategic operating mandates to be able to ensure that they cushion the effects as they come.
All right.
And
okay.
just on the side, okay, go ahead.
No. I want you to conclude because we need to go on a break pretty soon.
Okay. So just to be able to get that in context, my company are working around within the African space. We kick off from Nigeria and Ghana to be able to provide some strategic directive to be able to help to be able to manage the expectations of their reserves and their production and how to sustain most of the issues around their operational effectiveness to ensure that the goal is very clear to get their production stabilized in a time of shock.
Okay, so basically you're saying it's all about strategic mappings when it comes to managing reserves and of course outputs. But then Desmond, you would have to stay with us for a while. I'll get back to you. All right, now President Joe Biden on March 31 announced the United States would sell 180 million barrels of crude for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at a rate of 1 million barrels per day starting in May, the biggest release from the stockpile since it was created in the 1970s. That is a man making a drastic decision. Is Africa taking a cue with the abundance of oil it possesses to curb hike in price and probably generate more revenue by producing more oil for the global markets? We get to find out even as we engage our guests at the other side of this break. Do stay with us. We'll be right back. Still with me on Business Edge is Desmond Agboifo, an energy expert and director at Desyton Energy, and we have been considering the possible impacts the release of U.S. oil reserves will have on Africa. So we go back to Desmond. Well, thank you so much for staying with us. At the rate of 1 million barrels per day, the sale of U.S. reserves is said to be near equivalent to what African countries can deliver individually, so to speak. What sort of impacts should they be expecting by the time the sales go on in May?
Right. The impact will be a bit dramatic, to be honest, because a million barrels, taking that into consideration that, for example, the biggest producer of oil in Africa, with a focus on Nigeria, just turn around just about 1.92 million barrels. Just imagine that pumped into the market will, of course, increase the volume of oil in the market. And of course, that will also be a bit of a knock-on effect in the prices. So, I know efforts within the U.S. Economy seems to be able to manage that expectation so that the invasion of Russia in Ukraine that has a knock-on effect in the global scene right now should be managed. But I think it will create a bit of a shock within the African economy. And just a case in point, when we look at the issue around Russia, which is the center of discourse now globally, we can see that Russia pumped just about 10% of the national oil output. And if we put that in context and compare that to the volume of production that the U.S. turns out via outputs, we can see that will not be a good volume to be able to manage. So pumping that amount of oil out in the market in a bid to reduce the shock in the market prices would really have a knock-on effect on Africa and even in OECD countries.
Well, we cannot exonerate the fact that U.S.'s move on releasing oil from its reserve is aimed at insulating, or should we say protect itself from a global crisis in terms of hike in price and of course a scarcity. But then what do you think African countries can do now to also shore up their resources and, of course, mitigate the impact both internally and externally when you talk about its economy?
Right. So so within the global scene, and of course focus on the African space, African countries need to do a lot more. On the continent of Africa, we've got some key players pumping in quite a lot of volumes in the market, and with the plans, on the global scene, looking at what's going on right now, to be able to balance off the shock of the prices, and of course expectant in May, looking at the volumes coming into the market to be able to create some bit of a market balance in quotes. There's a lot that could be done within the African space, one of which is to be able to ensure that the policies on productions are fairly stable. And I think that's part of the drive for example, like where we've seen within the Nigerian government that has made a very forward step towards endorsing the PIA, the Petroleum Industry Bill. So these are part of the strategies that countries, for example, like Nigeria, has adopted, that will also help out to be able to manage the expectations in the process of shocks. We've seen very recently that right now there's going to be buffer within the Nigerian space, as a case in point, where right now your royalties are now being not just on a flat rate, it's now tied to either the market prices of oil, which is the prices in the barrel, and of course comparing that also with the inclusive prices or returns in terms of what the volumes of the locations would provide. So this is just one of these steps in the right direction, and I must commend the Nigerian government for doing that. However, looking at other countries, I know most countries would have what is called fiscal precepts that will ensure that the assets are being managed within the contents and constraints of availability and even sustainability. So these are some of the steps that could work. We've seen, for example, Angola and even Ghana even signing on to the Fiscal Policy Act, whereby they're able to produce within some set limits of their production barrels per day, and of course keeping that within the market to be able to sustain the prices and ensure that markets within the countries are being stabilized. And then, of course, there's also provisions to be able to get volumes all into the market scene to manage every issues that might come in the foreseeable future.
Well, you talked about Nigeria and other African countries and what they are doing in their own jurisdictions to rev up in terms of oil production. But then, could there be some sort of collaboration within these African oil-producing countries to see that they can improve in terms of capacity, infrastructure, in order to increase revenue and, of course, to increase output?
Obviously, the key word in the industry longer than now has been collaboration, and even ways to which companies can work together to ensure that efforts for productions have been sustained. And with that drive, we've seen of course very recently the impact of the World Bank and other world scale institutions even supporting that drive also towards collaborations. But all in all, countries would need to bear the brunt themselves to ensure that they take their best foot forward. The studies that we've carried out in the past, we've seen that the production levels for countries are not fairly flat. So what that really means is that countries have got high peaks of productions and other countries have got low peaks of productions. So of course, the collaborative effort will be a bit distinct to countries that have very similar agendas and goals. That will also help out to be able to tune out their strategies going forward.
All right, thank you so much, Desmond, for being so resourceful on Business Edge. Really appreciate your presence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you.
And you too. Well, Russia, which is part of OPEC Plus, produces about 10% of global oil supply, and Western sanctions are expected to cost the global market about 3 million barrels per day, according to IEA. Well, this might just be an ample opportunity for Africa to step up production and supply if it hopes to make more revenue, critically needed for rapid development. And that's about it on the show. But then we run off on this break, and when we return, we get to bring up business that is NC4 to watch. Do stay with us. Looking at the top trending 4 stories on NC4 to watch, that is around the business world. Let's tell you that oil prices climbed on Tuesday as fears of a demand downturn in China eased after Shanghai relaxed some COVID-19 related restrictions, and OPEC warned it would be impossible to increase output enough to offset lost Russian supply. Brent crude futures went up by $1.72 or 1.75% to $100.20 a barrel, and U.S. West Texas Intermediate contracts were up by $1.76 or 1.87% to $96.05 a barrel at 0405 GMT. Both contracts had settled down around 4% on Monday. Moving on, Kenya has announced plans to exempt locally assembled passenger cars from VAT and excise duty, looking to reduce the prices of the automobiles as well as encourage local assembly. If implemented, it will see the cars exempted from the entire major taxes applicable on fully built units imported from South Africa, the UK and Japan. Elsewhere, gold climbed for a fifth straight day amid risk of sentiment in markets as traders assess comments from the Federal Reserve on its monetary policy tightening trajectory ahead of the release of U.S. inflation data later on Tuesday. Spot gold climbed 0.3% to $1,959.34 an ounce at 12 p.m. in Singapore after rising 0.3% on Monday. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index was little changed after 8 straight days of gains. Palladium, platinum and silver advanced. And finally, the International Monetary Fund will consider finalizing a proposed new lending trust on Wednesday, with the climate change and sustainability focused initiative eventually providing $50 billion for vulnerable countries. The board is set to discuss the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, and staff are optimistic that approval will be granted. IMF economist Vimal Tekor said in an online event on Monday. Front officials in January had said that they hoped for approval before the institution's spring meetings, which will start next week. And that's it on today's edition of Business Edge. Join us some other time. But then do not forget that you can visit our website. That is www.newscentralafrica. And of course, you can visit our social media platforms. That is at News Central TV to join the conversation and be part of everything that we have for you on there. Until next time, my name is Lekan Onabanjo. Do enjoy the rest of your day.